Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The Washington Post back in September had an analysis of vote patterns in Wisconsin for the past 4 years. And most of the time, it looks like the majority of votes for assembly candidates and the majority of votes for Senate candidates since 2016 have been won by Republicans statewide. So as an example, in 2022, Republicans won 53% of the votes for the assembly and 65% of the seats in the assembly. They won 61% of the vote in the Senate and 71% of the seats in the Senate. So that is kind of the outcome that you would expect in a system where it's a first past the post election system. The candidate who wins by one vote wins that seat. There are a few years that look like aberrations, the biggest one being 2018. There apparently, in that election, 45% of the votes for assembly candidates went to Republicans, and they still ended up with 64% of the seats. And so, Kim, that is what you hear complaints about the Wisconsin maps and how they are partisan gerrymandered. But a couple of things, I think Colin is right that there is something to the argument that Democrats in a lot of states, including Wisconsin, are concentrated in big cities like Madison, cities like Milwaukee. And so it gives a natural geographic advantage in some of these states to Republicans, because even if you draw the district lines with traditional criteria where the Madison, Wisconsin seats are all going to be centered on Madison, Wisconsin, that kind of has an effect of packing Democratic voters into those seats, even if it's not an intentional effect. That's just where the Democrats in Wisconsin happen to live. And so I get the frustrations with gerrymandering. On the other hand, it does look like Wisconsin is a pretty much a Republican state at this point.
Yes, and you can point out, I guess the other way to say that is that Republicans have long argued that they have a natural geographic advantage because of that. And what Democrats would prefer to see, and you've seen this happen in other states. Take New York right now, which is continuing to go through its third or fourth round, I think, over gerrymandering and seats. You know, one of the things that the high court there ended up striking down was a map that, for instance, purposely snaked a very concentrated Democratic district in the middle of New York City into a bit of Long Island, which had been a Republican seat, in order to dilute that seat, as it were, of Republican voters by packing more Democrats into that seat, making it harder for Republicans to win. So gerrymandering can be both an offensive and a defensive tactic here. You can both use it to try to make sure your district is forever the party persuasion that you would like it to be, but you can also use it to try to dilute the ability of the other party to win as many seats as they might otherwise. And, you know, that's the kind of gamesmanship that we see happening in Wisconsin. And we can talk a lot about the exact ways that these lines are done. I think the bigger point of this news that came out of Wisconsin, which Colin has been talking about, is the very naked political nature by which this is now happening at the court level. Meaning, you know, we basically had a Wisconsin Supreme Court judge who won a primary earlier this year by complaining about the rigged maps, by saying essentially that if she made it onto the court, that one of the things she was going to do, she was throw it out, which essentially she campaigned on this and then refused to recuse herself, of course, which she arguably should have done when this case came up, given that she'd prejudged it. And so I think it's just says something about the growing toxicity of the gerrymandering pursuit. Look, legislatures have long tried to use their partisan advantage, if they've won at the time in the years after a census, to make the maps in a way that favors their party. That's the way it's gone. But this has become much more nakedly political at a judicial level. And that's what we've seen happen in Wisconsin.
And to that point, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Colin, is that this lawsuit was filed a day after the installation of now Justice Protasiewicz, which also makes clear the political import of this. And I would just second also your argument on the principles that the justices are laying out, that they will enforce political neutrality in any map that is approved by the courts, because the majority says that these non-contiguous areas appear in a majority of the districts in both the House and the Senate. But one way that a Supreme Court could go about fixing a situation like that is by saying we are going to fix that non-contiguity. We are going to go through and in the most minimal way possible fix what we see as that constitutional infirmity. And instead, they don't want to do that at all. In fact, they repudiate this idea of a least changes solution to this problem. Instead, they say we need to start over. And while we're starting over, we're the Supreme Court and we're an independent branch of government. And so we're going to enforce some kind of view of political neutrality. And that's in tension with the idea that the majority also says, which is that redistricting is a legislative power. And the more that they try to enforce their own ideas of what redistricting ought to look like, the more they're encroaching on that legislative power. When they wouldn't need to do that if they were doing some small, minute changes in order to fix the problems that they've identified.
I think that's right. And I think there's no question that this was in the planning during Justice Janet Protasiewicz's election campaign. And that's why everything was already all prepared to have those briefs filed the day after she arrived in office. We knew that was going to be the play, and that was in fact the play. And, it played out pretty much just as everyone expected it was going to. And here we are. And I think that's also, of course, the same reason why the justices didn't take that path of least change that you're referring to, that they could have just addressed the primary issue that they used as their legal pretense, which was the contiguity of these maps, but said, hey, while we're at it, we're actually going to reconsider the entire partisan makeup of these maps and try to do this in a way. They sort of try to paint what they're doing in throwing aside these maps as some sort of a judicial virtue, that they're going to try to make the maps as fair as possible. And that they are, of course, going to have to take partisan considerations into account when they do that. But we also need to recognize here the outrage of what this court did in terms of just boldly overturning precedent. The Wisconsin Supreme Court already approved the constitutionality of these maps in 2022 in a case called Johnson versus Wisconsin Elections Commission. So the court looked at this and said, well, we think that case was improperly decided and we have a different view. And so we're just going to throw aside stare decisis and move ahead with what we think is in the best interest of the maps here. So I think that's offensive on the level of judicial activism. And it really means that, these judicial elections that we've been watching in so many different states have become such a toxic political proxy, where all of a sudden just the shift of a court from one party to another with one justice of flipping the balance of power on the court means that the court is therefore going to take everything that went before and disregard their peers and send everyone in a completely different direction. I think that is deeply problematic.
Kim, you brought up New York earlier, and my last thought here is that gerrymandering can be ugly, and both sides do it in states red and states blue. But it does seem like there is a particular attention in the media to a few of these states where Republicans have had some success, and much less attention to places like New York or Illinois or California. And there are different states that have tried different approaches to cutting back on gerrymandering, including these independent commissions. But it's tough because sometimes even solutions like that just become partisan proxy fights, because the Republicans and the Democrats know that whoever gets the tie-breaking seat on the commission is the person who is going to end up drawing the map. And so I don't have a great solution to the gerrymandering problem, but I think that all the media attention to one place in particular, Wisconsin, gives a skewed view of what's really happening in all sorts of states, both red states and blue states all across the country.
Agreed. And you're right that there is an outsized focus on certain states. In addition, we've heard a lot recently about some new map fights in Alabama and Louisiana, especially the Supreme Court earlier this year, back in June, required Alabama to go back to its map and draw a second Black majority district. a decision which, by the way, threw a whole bunch more confusion into the arena, given that the Supreme Court in the past has chided some states for putting too much attention on race in going about their gerrymandering. So that's a bit of a muddle. Look, as you say, Kyle, there has been a long-standing fight over this. Gerrymandering is very, very old. There have been fights over this immemorial and lots of different attempts at the state level, the state legislature level, to create better ways of going about doing this, whether it's independent commissions or whatever. And those, as you say, don't always work out very well either. The real fault here, though, I think goes back to about 2010, when there was very conscious effort following that midterm wipeout by Barack Obama, where Democrats got shellacked. Eric Holder, who was the attorney general at the time, then left office and made a mission out of politicizing the courts on this. And notably, his first intention had been to influence state legislative elections to make sure Democrats had bigger majorities in times after the census. And when he didn't do well at that, he turned his attention to state Supreme Courts. And ever since then, the trend to further draw courts into this political arena, I think, has been very toxic for a situation that was already very politically ugly, meaning the gerrymandering fight. And that's what we ought to be focused on. I think we're not going to solve the gerrymandering question overnight. But when we've got to a point where there is a candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court who is openly campaigning against rigged maps and essentially promising elect me and I'll fix this from a partisan perspective on behalf of Democrats, we've really got into worse territory. And that's what I think we need to be worried about and focused on changing.
Thank you, Kim and Colin. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.